The illusion of ownership and the corruption of love is one of the darkest threads woven through the story of the Alabama twin sisters and the man they believed they possessed. Ownership, when it comes to another human being, is a lie, a cruel illusion built on power, fear, and the refusal to see another soul as equal. Yet in the time and place these sisters lived, that illusion was law, it was custom, it was inheritance. They were raised to believe that to own a person was as natural as owning the land they walked on. It was a concept so deeply engraved into their minds that they could not separate affection from control, compassion from command. When they looked at him, they did not see a man with dreams, pain, and dignity. They saw what they were taught to see: property, something to share, something to use, something to possess. But love has never belonged inside chains. When affection grows in the soil of ownership, it becomes poisoned, because real love requires freedom. The twins thought they loved him in their own way, but their love was distorted by the system that allowed them to believe he was theirs to keep. It was love filtered through power, through desire, through envy. One wanted what the other had, and neither could see the destruction it caused to the soul they claimed to cherish. The man himself, trapped between their rivalry, lived a life of emotional torment, used as a token in a game that mocked both love and humanity. The illusion of ownership turned human connection into competition and emotion into control. This story forces us to confront a truth we still wrestle with. Whenever love is built on control, it stops being love. The sisters may have felt passion, may have felt something that resembled affection, but it was corrupted from the moment they believed they had a right over his body, his time, his choices. Ownership turned intimacy into exploitation. It blurred the line between affection and abuse. They lived under a delusion that they could possess a human heart as easily as a piece of land, but no heart has ever belonged to another by force. The tragedy deepens when you realize that this illusion did not only destroy the man's life, it destroyed theirs as well. Their envy of each other grew from the same root of possession. One sister's love was never enough without the other's jealousy. They fought not for the man himself, but for the feeling of power that came with controlling him. Their hearts became mirrors of the same cruelty that enslaved him. The system that made them powerful also made them blind. The illusion of ownership corrupted not just their view of him, but their understanding of love itself. This is what happens when humanity is divided into those who think they own and those who are owned. The owners lose their souls, while the enslaved lose their freedom. The illusion comforts one side and crushes the other. The twins' affection could never redeem the wrongness of the structure they lived within. Even when emotions entered the picture, those emotions were twisted by a world that denied his humanity. Their so-called love became an extension of their power, not a challenge to it, and when that love produced life, two pregnancies born of the same deception, it only multiplied the tragedy. Children born from a love that could never be pure, a bond that could never be equal, a relationship that was never free. The illusion of ownership did not end with the sisters. It passed through generations as silence, as shame, as wounds that never healed. Because once people convince themselves they can own others, they begin to lose the ability to love truthfully. The heart becomes a ledger, the soul becomes property, and affection becomes just another transaction. Love loses its holiness when chained to power. True love can only exist between equals, and equality was the one thing denied in that story. It is the lesson that echoes through time, whispering through every broken heart that ever tried to love while holding on too tight to control the silence of suffering beneath privilege, is one of the most haunting aspects of the story of the Alabama twin sisters and the man they enslaved. It is the quiet that lies under the surface of comfort, the kind of silence that exists not because there is peace, but because the voices of pain have been deliberately buried. Privilege builds walls high enough to keep out the sound of suffering, and in those walls, people convince themselves that silence means order, that absence of protest means acceptance. The sisters lived in a world where comfort came at the expense of cruelty, yet they were taught not to see it. Their days unfolded in luxury, in inherited ease, in the rhythm of a system that demanded obedience from some so that others could live without worry. And beneath that soft rhythm, in the spaces between their laughter and envy, a man suffered quietly, unseen, unheard, unacknowledged. The silence was not accidental, it was maintained. The world around them demanded it. Those who benefited from the system had to ignore the cries that would make them human again. To hear him was to see him, and to see him was to question everything they had been taught about themselves. So they silenced him, not always with words, but through indifference, through the daily rituals of control, through the polite cruelty of pretending he did not feel as they did. Privilege allows people to create a version of reality where the pain of others becomes invisible, and in that invisibility, the cycle continues. The twins were victims of their own blindness, caught in a world where silence was more comfortable than truth. Yet silence is never truly still. It hums beneath every action, it echoes in every look, it haunts every night. The man they enslaved carried his suffering like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. He spoke little, not because he had nothing to say, but because the cost of speech was too high. Every emotion he felt, love, fear, anger, exhaustion, was swallowed by the knowledge that his voice did not matter in a world that had erased his right to exist as a person. And in that erasure, his silence became both his prison and his shield. For those who suffer under privilege, silence is often the only way to survive. The sisters' privilege blinded them not only to his suffering, but also to their own decay. They mistook comfort for happiness, control for strength, and silence for peace. They could not see that the system that made them powerful was also hollowing them out. Their jealousy of each other grew louder as the man's voice grew quieter. They filled their lives with rivalry to drown out the unease that haunted them. Deep down, they knew something was wrong, but privilege gives people 1,000 ways to escape the truth. They hid behind family names, property, social rules, anything that could keep the silence intact. This silence stretched beyond their home, into the fields, the town, the generations that followed. It was the kind of silence that built nations and buried guilt. It became the background noise of history, where suffering was normalized and compassion was treated as weakness. Even when their actions produced life, even when the consequences became undeniable, the silence remained. It wrapped around the story like a veil, so that even those who came after would speak of the twins and their tragedy without naming the man who bore the real weight of it. His suffering existed in the shadows of their legacy, remembered not as a person but as part of their story, and that is what privilege does. It turns pain into a footnote. Beneath every structure of power, there is a layer of hidden grief. The suffering of those who are silenced becomes the foundation that keeps the privileged standing tall. The tragedy of the sisters was not just what they did, but what they never allowed themselves to hear. The silence beneath their privilege was not empty. It was full of unspoken pain, unheard cries, and untold truths. And that silence did not die with them. It seeped into the soil of their land, into the bloodlines that followed, into the stories that were rewritten to make the powerful look gentle and the powerless seem invisible. That silence is what keeps injustice alive, not through shouting, but through the quiet agreement of those who benefit from not listening. The generational scars of moral blindness are the hidden wounds that time refuses to heal. They are passed down quietly, like whispers carried through the blood, shaping families, communities, and entire societies long after the original sin has been committed. In the story of the Alabama twin sisters and the man they enslaved, moral blindness began as a way to survive within an evil system, but it became something far more dangerous, a legacy. It was not just the sisters who were blind to the humanity of the man they controlled. It was the world around them that had trained them not to see. Their blindness was taught, rewarded, and inherited, and it laid the groundwork for generations to repeat the same cruelty under different names. When people refuse to face what is wrong, their silence and excuses become the inheritance of those who come after them. The twins lived in a time when morality was written by those in power, and anything that challenged that was dismissed as weakness. They never questioned the world they were given because questioning it would have meant losing their place within it. Their blindness was not an accident. It was a choice disguised as duty. And that choice did not end when they died. It lived on in the children born from their deception, in the bloodlines that carried the shame of both privilege and pain. Those children grew up in a world that whispered two conflicting truths, one of superiority and one of hidden sorrow. The result was a fractured identity, a confusion about who they were and what their worth truly meant. This is how moral blindness becomes generational. It confuses right and wrong until people cannot tell which side of history they stand on. Every generation that came after inherited a piece of that blindness. Some carried the guilt of what their ancestors did, while others carried the pain of what their ancestors endured. The descendants of the sisters may have lived comfortably, yet their lineage was built on brokenness. The descendants of the enslaved man may have carried resilience, yet their lives were shaped by the trauma of dehumanization. Both sides bore scars, one visible and one invisible. The tragedy of moral blindness is that it does not stop with those who commit the wrong. It poisons the roots of the entire tree. The lies people tell to justify cruelty eventually rot the soul of a nation, and those lies echo long after the chains have been removed. Generational scars are not always physical. They show up in the way people love, in the way they trust, in the way they define worth. The sisters' world taught them that control was love and silence was peace. That twisted belief did not vanish with them. It seeped into the way their descendants saw relationships, power, and compassion. The inability to see another's humanity becomes a habit, and habits passed through generations turn into culture. What began as one family's moral blindness became part of the collective memory of a people, shaping how history would be remembered and how truth would be told. The scars were not only in the hearts of the oppressed, but also in the souls of the oppressors, who lost their capacity for empathy even as they held all the power. Moral blindness breeds denial, and denial breeds distance. The descendants who came later may have wanted to forget, to rewrite the story in softer tones, to call it something less cruel than what it was. But the past has a way of resurfacing. The truth does not die. It waits. It waits in old letters, in family records, in whispered rumors about children who did not fit the expected story. And when that truth finally comes to light, it demands to be felt. It brings back the pain that privilege tried to erase. The scars reopen, and people must face the reality that what was once seen as normal was never right. That is the burden of inherited blindness. It ensures that no generation can escape the truth forever. The generational scars of moral blindness remind us that time alone does not heal what people refuse to confront. The Alabama twins may have died long ago, but the moral decay that allowed them to share a man's life as property did not die with them. It lived on in attitudes, in laws, in the quiet prejudices that linger even when the chains are gone. Healing only begins when eyes that were once blind choose to see. Until that happens, every generation walks through the same shadows, repeating the same mistakes, carrying the same unspoken pain, pretending the past is gone while still living in its ghost.